The roundhouse was smaller than usual that night. December 2006, Camden. A Thursday that felt like any other Thursday until it wasn't. The venue smelled like stale beer and fresh anticipation. Red velvet seats worn thin by decades of music lovers. Low lighting that made everything feel intimate, conspiratorial. The kind of place where artists came to test new material, to be vulnerable, to connect with audiences who understood that they were witnessing something rare. Amy had played the roundhouse 3 times before. Each time felt like coming home. The acoustics were perfect for her voice. They amplified every whisper, every crack, every moment of raw emotion. The technical crew knew her preferences. Dim the house lights, keep the spotlight soft. Let the music speak first. Amy Winehouse stood backstage, adjusting the flower in her hair. The venue held maybe 300 people. Intimate. The kind of room where you could see every face, read every expression, feel every heartbeat in the crowd. Her dressing room was barely larger than a closet, a cracked mirror reflecting fluorescent lights. Makeup scattered across a fold-out table. Half a bottle of wine, lukewarm, sitting next to her set list. She'd been nursing it for an hour, not for courage, but for something to do with her hands. The opening act, a folk duo from Manchester, was finishing their final song. She could hear scattered applause through the thin walls, polite but not enthusiastic. Thursday night crowds were different. They came to listen, not to party. They came for the music itself. Amy checked her appearance one final time. Black dress, simple. Hair piled high with that single red flower. Eyeliner perfect, as always. She looked like herself, which was all that mattered. She'd never been one for costumes or personas. What you saw was what you got. Her phone buzzed. A text from her manager. House is 3/4 full. Good crowd. You ready? She didn't respond. Instead, she peered through the side curtain that separated backstage from the venue proper. Front row, center. There he was. Blake. Her Blake. Except he wasn't hers anymore. They'd broken up 4 months ago. A messy, painful end to something that had burned too bright to last. Blake was charming, dangerous, the kind of man who made you feel alive and reckless at the same time. He'd inspired some of her best songs and her worst decisions in equal measure. The breakup had been inevitable. They were too similar. Both artists, both volatile, both incapable of the kind of steady love that lasted. But knowing it was inevitable didn't make it hurt less when it happened. Amy hadn't seen him since the night he'd packed his things and left her flat in Camden. He'd taken his books, his guitar, his leather jacket that always smelled like cigarettes and ambition. He'd left behind a coffee mug, a photograph of them at a festival last summer, and the lingering scent of his cologne in her bedroom. She'd written 3 songs about him in the weeks that followed. Raw, honest songs about love and loss and the space between what you want and what you can have. She'd planned to debut one tonight, but now sitting next to him, fingers interlaced with his, was someone else. A blonde girl with perfect makeup and a nervous smile. She was young, younger than Amy, maybe 22 or 23. Pretty in a conventional way that Amy had never been. The kind of girl who probably studied business or psychology, who had normal relationships with normal people, who'd never written a song about heartbreak at 3 in the morning. The girl kept looking around the venue like she was somewhere she didn't belong. This wasn't her scene. Amy could tell from her posture, the way she sat perfectly straight in her seat, the way she checked her phone every few minutes. She was here for Blake, not for the music. Blake, meanwhile, looked entirely too comfortable. He was wearing the black button-down shirt Amy had bought him for his birthday, the one he'd worn the night they first kissed outside a pub in Soho. He'd chosen it deliberately. Amy was sure of that. Amy let the curtain fall back. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. This was what Blake wanted, she realized. He wanted to see her reaction. He wanted to know that he could still affect her, still get under her skin even after all this time. Well, she'd give him a reaction, just not the one he expected. Her band was warming up behind her. Dale on guitar, tuning and retuning the same string. Marcus on bass, running through scales with his eyes closed. James behind the kit, adjusting his snare for the 5th time. They'd been playing together for 2 years. They knew her moods, her signals, her tendency to change things at the last minute. The opening act had finished to scattered but genuine applause. Thursday night crowds were smaller but more attentive. The people who came out on weeknights were serious about their music. They'd come to listen, not to be seen. In 5 minutes, she'd be on that stage. In 5 minutes, she'd have to decide what kind of show this was going to be. She walked to her set list taped to the wall backstage, written in her own handwriting on the back of a bar napkin. 7 songs that told the story of the last year of her life. Personal songs, vulnerable songs, songs that assumed the audience was full of strangers. Amy picked up a pen from the makeup table, crossed out "Stronger Than Me," crossed out "In My Bed," crossed out "Take the Box." In their place, she wrote 3 different titles, songs Blake would recognize, songs that meant something specific to both of them, songs that would make him remember exactly who they'd been together and why it had ended. "Change of plan," she told Dale quietly, handing him the revised set list. He glanced at the paper, then at her face, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this?" Amy smiled. It wasn't a particularly nice smile. "I'm sure." The house lights dimmed. Amy heard the shift in the crowd's energy. Conversations trailing off, phones being put away, attention focusing toward the stage. This was the moment she'd been preparing for since she was 15 years old, singing in her bedroom mirror with a hairbrush microphone. She took a deep breath and walked onto the stage to scattered applause. The roundhouse wasn't full, maybe 250 people in a venue that held 300. But the energy was good, expectant, respectful. Amy approached the microphone, her heels clicking against the wooden stage floor. The spotlight was warm on her face, bright enough to blur the audience into shadows and silhouettes. But she knew exactly where Blake was sitting. She could feel his presence like a magnetic pull. She adjusted the microphone down slightly, a familiar ritual that bought her a few seconds to settle into the space. This was her element. On stage, she was in complete control. Whatever vulnerability she felt off stage disappeared the moment she stepped into the light. She looked out at the crowd, letting her eyes adjust, letting the moment breathe. Some artists rushed into their first song, eager to fill the silence. Amy had learned that silence was its own kind of music. It created anticipation, connection, intimacy. Her eyes found Blake immediately. He was sitting perfectly still, watching her with an intensity she remembered from their early days together. The blonde girl next to him was clapping politely, clearly trying to be supportive, despite not knowing what she was supporting. "Evening," Amy said into the microphone. Her voice was soft, conversational, like she was talking to friends in her living room. She turned to her band. "Let's start with something different tonight." The bassist looked confused. They'd rehearsed a specific opening, but he followed her lead. They always followed her lead. Amy's fingers found the first chord on her guitar, a minor progression that felt like heartbreak before she'd sung a single word. The chord hung in the air for a moment, rich and melancholic, setting the emotional temperature for what was about to follow. "You know I'm no good," she began. The first line came out soft, almost conversational, like she was sharing a secret with a close friend. But her voice carried perfectly through the room, that rare quality that made every person in the audience feel like she was singing directly to them. Her voice cut through the room like it always did, smoky, vulnerable, impossibly precise. There was something in her tone that made people lean forward, strained to catch every word. She sang like someone who had lived every line she was singing, who had earned the right to these words through experience and pain. But tonight there was something else in her voice, something focused, something aimed. Amy sang the first verse looking out at the general crowd, professional, controlled. She moved between the chorus and verse with the confidence of someone who had performed these songs hundreds of times, who knew exactly how each phrase should breathe, where each note should land. But when she reached the chorus, when the song built to its emotional peak, her eyes locked onto the front row, onto him. "You know I'm no good for you," she sang, and it wasn't a confession anymore. It was a statement, a fact delivered with surgical precision. Each word weighted, deliberate, inescapable. Blake shifted in his seat. The casual confidence he'd walked in with was beginning to crack. The blonde girl looked uncomfortable. She glanced at Blake. then back at Amy, then at Blake again. Something in the air had shifted. The temperature of the room had changed. Other audience members were beginning to sense the tension, the way certain conversations in a restaurant make nearby tables go quiet and attentive. Amy moved closer to the edge of the stage. The spotlight followed her, creating a pool of warm light that seemed to isolate her from everything else in the room. She was maybe 10 feet from where Blake sat, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the coolness of the December evening. I cheated myself like I knew I would, she continued, but her eyes never left his face. I told you I was trouble. You know that I'm no good. The words landed like physical blows. Blake's face had gone pale. He was gripping the armrest of his seat, his knuckles white against the red velvet. The casual confidence he'd walked in with, that swagger that had first attracted Amy to him, was evaporating under her relentless gaze. The song built to its climax, Amy's voice getting stronger, more insistent. She wasn't just singing anymore. She was testifying, bearing witness to something that had happened between them, something private that was now being made public in the most intimate way possible. Behind her, the band was locked in. Dale's guitar provided the perfect counterpoint to her voice. Marcus's bass line walked beneath the melody like a heartbeat, and James's drums pushed the song forward with restrained intensity. They could feel what was happening, could sense the electricity in the room, and they played with the precision of musicians who understood they were part of something bigger than a typical performance. The blonde girl whispered something to Blake, probably asking if he was okay, if he knew why the singer kept staring at him. He shook his head without looking away from Amy, caught in her gravitational pull, like a planet unable to break free from its star. When the song ended, the room was silent for a beat longer than usual. Amy let the silence stretch, let it become part of the performance. The final chord faded into nothing, leaving only the sound of people breathing, waiting, wondering what would happen next. Then she spoke. That one was for someone special in the audience tonight, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the venue. Someone who knows exactly what it means. The words hung in the air like smoke. Simple, direct, devastating. Amy turned to her band, gave them a barely perceptible nod, and moved into the next song without announcing it. The opening chords of Back to Black filled the room. Another choice that wasn't on the original set list. Another song that Blake would recognize. Another knife twisted with surgical precision. Blake started to stand up, his body language screaming discomfort, escape, the need to flee. The blonde girl grabbed his arm, confused and increasingly panicked. She was beginning to understand that she was at the center of something she didn't comprehend, something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the history between her boyfriend and the woman on stage. He sat back down, but his leg was bouncing now. Nervous energy coursing through him like electricity looking for ground. Amy sang about going back to black, about dying 100 times, about the end of love and the beginning of something darker. Her voice wrapped around the words like smoke, like velvet, like a knife that cut clean and deep. Every line felt personal. Every word felt like it was being delivered specifically to the couple in the front row. The song was about addiction, about loss, about the way love could destroy you and remake you in its image. But tonight, in this room, it was about Blake and Amy and the wreckage of what they'd built together. The blonde girl was looking around the room now, finally realizing she was at the center of something she didn't understand. Other audience members were starting to notice the tension, the way Amy kept looking at the same spot, the way the man in the front row looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Some people in the crowd were beginning to piece it together. The intensity of Amy's gaze, the deliberate song choices, the way she kept addressing her comments to someone special in the audience. This wasn't just a concert. This was a confrontation, a public reckoning. Halfway through the second song, Blake stood up abruptly. The movement was sharp, desperate, like someone breaking the surface of deep water. The blonde girl looked panicked, glancing between Blake's pale face and Amy's unrelenting presence on stage. He took her hand and started moving toward the exit, not running but walking with obvious urgency. The blonde girl stumbled slightly, trying to keep up with his longer stride while simultaneously trying to process what was happening. Her carefully composed evening was unraveling, and she didn't understand why. Amy watched them go, her voice never wavering. She finished the verse, finished the chorus, but her eyes followed them all the way to the door, like a predator tracking prey. Even as she sang about her own heartbreak, her own destruction, there was something triumphant in her gaze. She was winning this confrontation simply by refusing to be the one who looked away first. When the heavy venue doors closed behind them with a muffled thud, cutting off their silhouettes from the dim light of the lobby, something in the room shifted again. The tension that had been building since Amy took the stage, suddenly released like a held breath, finally let go. Amy finished the song to thunderous applause, louder and more sustained than the scattered clapping that had greeted her entrance. The remaining audience seemed to understand they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that transcended the typical boundaries between performer and audience. When the applause died down, something in Amy's posture loosened slightly. The laser focus that had defined her first two songs softened into something more familiar, more welcoming. She looked out at the remaining crowd and smiled for the first time that night. A real smile, not the sharp-edged expression she'd worn while Blake was in the room. "Well," she said, "now we can really get started." The rest of the concert was different, looser, more playful. Amy told jokes between songs. She interacted with the audience. She seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She played for another hour. Songs of love, songs of loss, songs of hope. Her voice soared and whispered and everything in between. The crowd was mesmerized. This was Amy at her most present, most alive. When she finished her last song, the applause was thunderous despite the small venue. People stood. They cheered. They didn't want her to leave. Amy bowed slightly. "Thank you, Camden," she said. "You're home." She walked off stage to find her manager waiting in the wings. "What was that about?" he asked. Amy shrugged. "Just clearing the air." The story spread through Camden's music scene within days. People who were there told people who weren't. The details got embellished, dramatized, turned into legend. But the core remained the same. Amy had faced down her past in the most public way possible. She'd used her art as a weapon and a shield simultaneously. Blake never came to another one of her concerts. Friends said he'd been shaken by the experience. The way she'd looked at him. The way she'd made 200 strangers witnesses to their private pain. Months later, a music journalist tracked him down for an interview about Amy. Most of her exes wouldn't talk. But Blake was different. He seemed to need to explain himself. "She had every right to be angry," he said. "I brought someone else to her show. That was cruel. I knew it was cruel when I did it." The journalist asked why he'd done it. "I wanted to show her I'd moved on," Blake admitted. "I wanted to hurt her the way she'd hurt me. But watching her that night, seeing how she handled it," he paused, "I realized I hadn't moved on at all. I was still completely under her spell. And she knew it. She'd always known it. That's what made her Amy." He was quiet for a long moment. "The girl I brought with me, she asked me afterward what that was all about. I tried to explain, but how do you explain Amy to someone who's never been in love with her? How do you explain what it's like to be the subject of her attention, whether it's love or anger or anything in between?" The journalist pressed him. "What was it like being on the receiving end of those songs?" "Devastating," Blake said without hesitation. "She didn't scream at me. She didn't cause a scene. She just sang. But every word felt like it was written specifically for me in that moment, like she could see inside my soul and was describing what she found there." He paused again. "I've never felt so exposed in my life. And the worst part was, everything she was singing was true. I was no good for her. I did cheat myself. I was trouble. She'd told me all of this when we were together, but I hadn't listened. That night she made me listen." The journalist asked if he regretted going to the show. Blake thought about it. "No," he said finally. "I needed to see who she'd become without me, and she needed to show me. It was closure for both of us, I think. Just not the kind I expected." The interview was published 6 months before Amy died. Blake refused all requests for follow-up interviews after her death. Friends said he was devastated by the news, that he blamed himself for not being there for her when she needed help. But people who were at the Roundhouse that night remember something different. They remember Amy in complete control. They remember her using her pain as fuel, turning her heartbreak into art that moved everyone in the room. They remember a woman who refused to be a victim of her own story, who faced her demons head on and transformed them into music that would outlive them all. The concert at the Roundhouse became part of Amy Winehouse mythology, proof that her power wasn't just in her voice, but in her complete emotional honesty, her willingness to be vulnerable in public while somehow maintaining total control. That night in Camden, Amy showed everyone what legendary really meant. Not perfection, not invulnerability, but the courage to be completely, devastatingly real, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt.